In this video, I'm going to show you how to add a jump to your player. So to make sure our player can jump, we need to add an input for this. We're going to go into our inputs folder, and then we're going to go inside our input actions editor for our player control scheme. In our action map called movement, we're going to add another action. We will call it jump. Make sure that in the action properties, the action type is set to button and the binding down here is set to space on the keyboard. Then hit save asset and let it compile. Now let's head into a player controller script from the previous video. Right now I only have a move speed variable, but for jumping I also need a value to control how strong the jump is. So right here under the move speed, I will create a new serialized field. It will be a private float. I will call it jump force, and I will set this to 12F for now. We can always change that later. Now, before we go any further, I also need to access the Unity input system because I want to create what is called a callback. This shows the game systems how to respond when the jump button is pressed. So to do that, up here in the top under the usings, I will add this line using Unity engine dot input system. Without this, Unity won't recognize input action callbacks, which we will use in a second for a jump method. Now let's scroll down to the awake method. At the moment, in Awake, I'm creating my player controls object, and I'm also getting the rigid body 2D component, but I would like to subscribe to the jump action as well. So inside Awake, under the rigid body line, I'm going to write player controls dot movement, so the name of our action map, dot jump, so the name of our action, jump performed, plus equals on jump. What this line does is say that when the jump action is performed, we would like to call the onJump method. And of course, we've not created this method yet, and that's why it's giving us an error. You can also see here it says the name onJump does not exist in the current context, and it suggests to generate a method called onJump. We'll do that briefly. The reason I'm not doing this in update as I did with my movement is to show you there's multiple ways to do this. So right now in our movement, we're manually checking every frame if the player pressed the A or D key, but instead we can just let the input system notify us when that happens. That can be a bit cleaner, and it works really well with the new Unity input system setup. Now that I'm subscribing to onJump, I need to actually create that method. Right here at the bottom, underneath all my other methods, I'm going to create the onJump method. We're going to type private void onJump, and we will need the parameter called input action dot callback context, and we will call this context. And inside the method body, we will access our rigid body variable. We will access the linear velocity, and this basically represents the movement of the rigid body. And we'll set this to new vector2 rigid body dot linear velocity dot x. So that's for the x value. And for the y value, we will use our jump force variable. So just to break this line down, this method happens whenever we press the spacebar button or whichever button we've set our jump action in our input actions editor. I set my linear velocity to the current x value because I don't want the jumping to stop the player's horizontal movement, and then I replace the y value with the jump force, which launches the player upward. So if the player is moving left or right and then jumps, they'll keep moving horizontally while also going upwards at the same time. Now at this point, you might expect our jumping to work perfectly, but there's actually a problem with the movement code from the previous video. Right now, in Move, we're using rigid body that move position. This worked just fine when all we wanted was simple movement left to right, but for jumping it causes technical issues because move position is actually manually moving the rigid body to a position every physics frame. So in theory, this move position can actually override what we're trying to do when we're jumping. So instead of move position, I'm actually going to change this to rigid body dot linear velocity equals a new vector2, which will be a movement dot x times our move speed, and then we'll also set the y value to be rigid body dot linear velocity dot y. Now this is a really important change. Now I'm only controlling the horizontal movement directly by setting the x velocity, and for the y velocity I'm leaving that part alone by just keeping the original linear velocity dot y value. So now we can save the script and go back into the Unity editor. Before playing my game, I'll just go to my player object and reset the gravity scale. I will set it to 3. Hello there, this is Future DevSpark speaking. Don't mind the change in sprites or the animation windows being open, this is just for a future video. Just a quick note on what that idiot who I call past me forgot to tell you. What you need to do to get our jump working properly is to go to your player game object, and then this rigid body 2D component. You want to open up this menu called constraints, and you want to tick this box which says freeze rotation on the Z axis. If we don't do this, and then jump up, for instance, on a platform and hit the platform at an angle, what can happen is that the player game object tilts over or falls. And we don't want that. We don't want rotation on our player in any way. So yeah, just a quick note. Back to the video. And I will also just add another 2D object. I will add a square. I'll just call it ground. I will expand the scale to make sure our player lands on it when it falls. And also I will add a box collider 2D. I will also add a box collider 2D to our player to make sure it doesn't fall through the ground. Now that we have that set up, we can try to play our game, and if we press space, our player jumps. Now we have a new problem though. If we just keep pressing space, our player can jump infinitely. This happens because right now I'm not checking whether the player is actually on the ground before allowing the player to jump. So the next step would be to add some sort of check if we're grounded. The first thing I would like to do here is going to my player object, right clicking, and I will create an empty child object. I will call it ground check. This adds a new game object as a child component to our player, and this will be used to check whether we're on the ground or not. I'll just move this a bit downwards so it's right here at the bottom of our player, and then I will head back into my player controller script. Up near the top of the script, right here underneath jump force, I'm going to add a new header just to keep things organized. This header will just be called ground check, and I will also add a header up here in the top over move speed and jump force. I'll just call this movement. If you do not know what headers are, let me just show you real quick. When we've got this script saved, we can jump back into Unity Editor, go to our player or whichever object the script is attached to. And if we go down to our player controller component, you can see now here we have this sort of heading called movement. When we add variables to the ground check as well, this will also get its own header. So this is just to make it more readable out in the inspector. You don't need headers really. It won't improve performance. It's just nice for readability. So for our ground check, I'm going to add 3 variables. They will all be serialized fields. So I will just highlight this line, duplicate it a few times, and we will first add a private transform, which we will call our ground check. We will also add a private float. We will call it ground check radius. I will set it to 0.2f for now. And finally, we would add a private layer mask ground layer. Do not worry if you don't know what a layer mask is. I will explain that just in a minute. I'm also going to create a new private bool, which I will call is grounded. Now let's just cover what these new fields will do. Ground check is going to be a transform placed at the player's feet. So the ground check that we've just created before as the empty game object. Then the ground check radius is the size of the circle that we'll use to detect whether we're on the ground or not. And the layer mask ground layer tells Unity which layers actually count as ground. We don't, for instance, want to collide with an enemy and then be able to jump from the enemy. We don't want to collide with a wall and then be able to jump off the wall. If you were to add something like enemy bouncing or wall jumps, you could do that. But for now, I will just add a simple ground check using only the ground layer. And finally, the bool is grounded is just a true or false value that stores whether the player is standing on something that we would define as ground. Now I need a method to actually check for the ground. So I think it fits good here below player input. Here I will add a new method, private void check is grounded. And then inside this method, I will simply just set is grounded equal to physics 2D dot overlap circle. This is the circle I talked about before. This will use a vector 2, which will be our ground check position. So the position of the empty game object we created before outside in the editor. It will also take in the ground check radius, which we've set to 0.2f, and then we'll look for layer mask, which is our ground layer. So in short, here's how this works. Physics 2D overlap circle creates an invisible circle at the position of the ground check. If that circle overlaps with any collider on the ground layer, it returns true, and if not, it returns false. So every time this runs, is grounded gets updated to match whether the player is standing on the floor or not. Now I need to call this method every frame, so I will do this inside update. So underneath player input, where we call that, I'm going to add check is grounded. So now each frame, Unity reads the movement input and also checks whether the player is grounded or not. Now that I know whether the player is on the ground, I can use that information in my jump method. So I'm going to go back to my onJump method, and inside the method body, I will add an if statement which checks whether the player is grounded. So if is grounded, then we can perform our jump. So we will move that inside of the if statement. And this if statement is what prevents infinite jumping. So right now we can only move if our ground check overlaps with the ground. So now if we go back into the Unity editor, we can go to our player, scroll down to a player controller script. We have our ground check radius, and we have a ground check which is empty right now. It needs a transform, and we will use the empty game object called ground check. So we will take that, drag into the player transform. But right now, if we play the game, you can see nothing happens when I press the spacebar. That is because we haven't set the ground layer. How do we set a new layer? Well, we can go to our ground object, and you can see in the top right-hand corner of the inspector, we have this thing called layers. And if you open up the layer, there are no ground layers yet, but you can instead add a layer. I'll just take user layer 3. What number layer you use does not matter at all. I will go back to my ground game object, and now I can set the layer to be ground. And inside of my player, I can go to the ground layer variable and then use this drop down menu to set it to ground. I will try to start the game, and you can see when the player lands on the ground, I press spacebar and it jumps. And if I keep pressing spacebar, nothing happens. It only jumps when the ground check actually detects that we're standing on what we've defined to be the ground. If the ground check feels a bit buggy, what you might need to do is go to the ground check game object and just move it around a little to make sure it aligns with where your player's feet should be at. In the next video, we will make the player jump feel even better by adding things like faster falling, variable jump height, because right now it works, but it still feels pretty basic and the jump can at times feel a bit floaty. But for this video, this is exactly what we wanted. We started with a movement controller from the last episode, we built on top of it and turned it into a proper platform controlling with jumping. I will leave the full script down below in the comments, so make sure to check that script out if you're having any trouble. Other than that, I highly recommend that you leave a comment if you have any sort of questions. But for now, I will say thank you for watching and subscribe for more content like this.